Hello, welcome back. In today's video, I'm going to be making another sewing tutorial, this time for a dungaree / overall dress for dolls. I'm going to be using a made-to-move Barbie as my model in today's video. However, as always, I'm going to include the instructions for getting your own measurements from whichever doll you want to make this for. So it should hopefully be applicable to multiple different doll body types and brands. I'm going to start out by sketching a basic sort of design for the dress. I'm thinking this should be a fairly easy one to make since it's pretty much just a few simple shapes sewn together. So first we have the kind of bib piece, which is basically just a rectangle. And then I guess I should tailor it a little bit to account for like hips by flaring it out slightly at the bottom. And then for a waistband, I'm just going to have what is essentially just a long, thin rectangle. Same goes for the straps. Then for the skirt, I'm just keeping it kind of A-line. I'll probably have it end sort of mid-thigh, although obviously you can vary that however much you like. And then for the back version of the bib, I'm going to change the shape a little bit and basically taper it a lot more towards the top so that when I add the straps, they connect in this sort of V-shape situation. Then all overalls need some good pockets, so I'm going to include one on the front bib, two on the front of the skirt, and two back pockets on the back of the skirt, kind of like a pair of jeans. And that is our design. Fairly simple shapes, like I said, so now we can move on to taking our measurements. Here is our model for today's video. She is the Odile mermaid Barbie that I put on a standard made-to-move body. I'm going to start out like I did with the sketch by getting a measurement for how wide I want the bib piece to be. And I'm going to go ahead and say 3 centimeters for that. Then I'm going to want to find how long the length of the bib needs to be, and if I'm going to have it end at about her waist, I'm going to go ahead and say that's 4 centimeters in length. Next we are going to need a waist measurement, and that comes out at about, I think I'm going to say about 9.5 centimeters. Next, I want to know how long the skirt piece needs to be, and I want it to end at about mid-thigh, so I'm measuring from the waist to mid-thigh, and that's coming out at about 7 centimeters for me. And then I also want to take a hip circumference from her, so just wrapping it all the way around again at the widest part of her hips. That comes out at 12.5 centimeters for me. For the final measurement, I'm going to need the length of the straps, so I'm just putting the end of the tape measure just above her chest and then wrapping it up and over her shoulder down to where I want the back bib to end, which is about here, and that comes out at 4.5 centimeters. So now that we have all of our measurements taken, I can go ahead and try to translate them into an actual pattern. For the pattern making, I have some graph paper, a ruler and a pencil, and I'm going to go ahead and start with the bib piece again. When we measured, we figured out that it needed to be 3 centimeters in width at the top. So I'm going to go ahead and draw a 3 centimeter horizontal line. Our next measurement for the length of the bib was 4 centimeters, so I'm going to draw 2 4-centimeter vertical lines to turn it into a rectangle kind of situation. For the bottom line, however, we're going to need our waist measurement, but only half of it, so I'm rounding up my 9.5 centimeter waist circumference to 10 centimeters, just so it's easier to divide by 2, which obviously gives us 5 centimeters. That means the next line we want to draw is a 5 centimeter horizontal line across the bottom of our rectangle. This type of thing is where the graph paper comes in really handy, because you want to make sure that the center of this bottom line matches up perfectly below the center point of the top line. Obviously, now though, you can see that we need to flare out the side lines towards the bottom, like I said in my design portion. So I'm going to start about a third of the way up, just kind of eyeballing it, and draw a curved line out from the straight side line to meet with the end of our 5 centimeter waistline. Doing the same on both sides. Now I can erase the bit of the sidelines at the bottom that we no longer need. And that is our first pattern piece finished. Next, we're moving on to the first skirt pattern piece. We are starting out with the halved waist measurement line at the top this time. So I'm going to draw another 5 centimeter horizontal line. Next, I'm going to want the skirt length measurement that we took. The one that I measured from the waist to the mid-thigh. That was 7 centimeters for my doll, so I'm measuring 7 centimeters directly down from that waistline and making a little mark where that lands. Next up, I'm going to need the hip measurement that we took, which was 12.5. But we're going to halve it once again, like we did with the waist. So I'm gonna go ahead and round it up to 13, which divided by 2 gives us 6.5 centimeters. This means that we need our skirt piece to be at least 6.5 centimeters wide at the point it gets to the hips. So I have that measurement of the distance from her waist to the widest part of her hips. And that was 3 centimeters. We're going to use that here and measure 3 centimeters down from the center of the waistline and make a little mark at that point. And then using that mark as our center point, I'm going to measure 6.5 centimeters horizontally and make a little mark at each end. Now, these marks are going to determine the angle you'll place your ruler at when drawing the next diagonal line down to the skirt hem. Because your line needs to start at the end of the waistline, travel through that 6.5 centimeter mark at the hips, and then keep following that same trajectory until you get to that 7 centimeter line from earlier. Repeat on both sides, and then just join them up at the bottom along the line of that 7 centimeter marker. And now you have your basic skirt pattern. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate that over here. You'll see why in a little bit. Now that that is done, I can work out a pattern for the pockets. Usually with functional pockets, there's a bit more involved, and if you're interested in seeing that process, I'd go back to my trouser making video. But this time I'm following a simpler design that you often find on things like overalls, where there's just one extra pattern piece per pocket. So for the one on the front of the bib, I'm literally going to just use my graph squares and the bib pattern itself to sketch out a shape for the pocket. I'm going for a classic kind of hexagonal situation, but you could just make this square or, to be honest, any kind of shape you want. Then I'm just going to use a spare piece of paper to copy the shape. You can also trace it if your paper is thin enough. And that is your pattern for the bib pocket. For the pockets on the front of the skirt, I'm again just using my graph squares and the pattern itself to sketch a curved line down from the waist and out towards the diagonal line at the side. Then I'm going to draw a horizontal line below that curve. How far below depends solely on how deep you want your pocket to be. And then another vertical line straight down from the waist, starting a bit further in towards the center of the waistline than the curved one, and just following it straight down until it meets the horizontal line we just drew. And then this shape right here that I'm filling in now is the pattern piece that you want to once again trace onto that scrap piece of paper. And that is going to be our pattern for the front pockets. So the reason I added the copy of the front skirt is so that we could use this as the reference for sketching the back pockets in the same way. I am using the same hexagonal kind of situation that I did for the front pocket so that they kind of match. I am sketching both, although we'll only need one, just to check that they'll both sit and fit nicely on the back of the skirt. We can trace once again, and now we have pattern pieces for all three kinds of pocket. Now that the back pockets are sketched out, I can go ahead and alter the back pattern for the skirt slightly. I have realised that it needs a closure so that we can actually get the doll into her dress. So, first of all, I'm going to split it down the centre. If we want to use something like Velcro, for example, we're going to need some extra width on the inside of the skirt so that the two pieces of Velcro can overlap. I'm only going to add this extra width to maybe the first third of the skirt length. I'm being quite generous and adding a whole extra centimetre just for my own peace of mind. And then I'm just connecting this extra little tab we've made back to the original edge with a diagonal line. And that's going to be the pattern for the back of our skirt. Next up, we need to do the back version of the bib. To make this as simple as physically possible, I'm once again gonna just replicate the first bib pattern. This gives us a base to work from. So I'm going to extend the pattern up a little bit higher, not by a huge amount, maybe just 1 square, or rather half a centimetre. And the other thing I wanted to change from the front bib to the back was to make the width a fair bit narrower. So I'm going to decrease the top width of the bib pattern from 3 centimetres wide to 2 centimetres, i.e. from 6 squares to 4 squares. Of course, that is going to influence the sides a bit, so I'm going to try and mirror the same curve of the original pattern, just a bit further in, making sure that the ends connect to the end of the 5 centimetre waistline in the same place. Now I'm just erasing the lines from the copy of the original bib that we made. And now we have a pattern for the back version of our bib. The last things we need are the most simple, and that is the waistband and the straps. Like I mentioned in the design portion, these are just going to be long, thin rectangles. The waist one, of course, needs to be 10 centimetres, or rather the length of your waist measurement. I'm going to make mine 1 square in width, or rather half a centimetre, and I'm going to make my straps the same width. However, I'm obviously going to need to use the measurement we took over her shoulders for the length of this one. I believe mine was 4.5 centimeters. However, I'm also going to round this up to 5 centimeters just to make sure I have enough overlap in the front. And so that is all of our pattern pieces finished. And now I'm just going to cut all of these out. Very fortunately, I have some cut-off fabric from some jeans that my mum was tailoring for herself, and as you can see, it's quite thin, so I think it will be perfect for this project. I'm going to start by cutting down the sides so that I can lay them out flat, and then I can place my pattern pieces down, making sure to leave plenty of space around the edges for my seam allowance, and then just trace around them. As you can see, I have one copy of the front skirt pattern, one of the front bib pattern, one of the back bib pattern, two of the back skirt pattern. I obviously flipped this over before tracing it a second time. Two of the front skirt pockets traced, two of the back skirt pockets traced, one of the front bib pocket, two of the strap pieces, and one of the waistband. So now that those are all done, I can go ahead and cut them out. As always, I'm adding the seam allowance as I cut the pieces out. This is just so that I can sew directly on top of the traced line. So I'm just leaving a bit of a border as I cut them out. While I have my fabric scissors out, I'm also going in and snipping some little cuts into the seam allowance wherever I have curves in my pattern. This will release the tension in the fabric and just make it easier to fold over the hem in those areas. Speaking of which, now it's time for me to hem the edges of my bib pieces. I'm going to use a contrasting kind of orangey yellow thread for this, just because a lot of jeans and dungarees have that as a common detail. I've also decided to snip some notches in the corners, and it just makes it a little bit easier for me to fold over the fabric along the seam allowance. And then I can just go ahead and backstitch that down into place. Obviously, these stitches are going to be fairly visible in the final piece, so I'm just trying my very best to be as neat as possible. I'm doing the same along both sides of the bib. Repeat with the other bib piece. I'm also hemming the top line of my bib pocket and the back pockets and the curved edges of my front skirt pockets. The next thing I'm going to do is attach the bib pocket. Now, first of all, you're going to want to fold in all the edges of your shape along the seam allowance. This is honestly extremely fiddly, so what I'm going to do is use a little bit of fabric glue just to tack the little edge pieces into place when I fold them over. And hopefully that should just ensure that the seam allowance doesn't become unfolded while I sew. Now I can just place it in the center of the bib wherever I want it to sit, and I'm going to use my contrasting yellow thread again to sew down the sides that we just folded. Now that that's all done, we have a functioning little pocket right here. I'm going to repeat the same process for the front skirt pockets, folding in the longest straight edges and using some fabric glue just to hold them down. and then lining up the remaining raw edges with the top and side of the skirt pattern, top stitching into place the folded over edges with my yellow thread again. Now that the front pockets are all attached, I'm switching over to some more matching thread, and I'm going to take the waistband piece I cut out, fold it in half to kind of find the approximate center, placing it good side to good side over the top of the center of the front bib piece, and unfolding it again, matching up the raw edges, and sew along the traced line of my pattern, attaching the bib piece to the waistband. Once that is attached, I can flip the waistband piece, and you can see it's formed kind of like a belt situation at the bottom of the bib. What I'm going to do now is basically repeat the same step by placing the skirt piece good side to good side with the opposite edge of the waistband piece, match up those raw edges, and sew along my traced pattern line once again. Now that that's attached, I'm going to flip the seam allowances in to kind of meet at the center, and that is the front portion of the waistband fully attached. Next, I'm going to tackle the back pieces of the skirt. First of all, I'm going to fold in the seam allowance on that little tab that we added for the closure, sewing down the straight line and then the diagonal one. And I also snipped a little notch into the seam allowance between the diagonal line and the raw edge, just to help me fold over that bit without disrupting the rest of the line. Then I'm going to place my back pocket. I've already turned the sides in with the fabric glue like I did for the others. When I'm centering it, I'm making sure not to take the tab into account, and then sewing down the edges with the yellow thread again. I, of course, also repeated this for the other back piece. Now I'm going to place one of the back pieces good side to good side with the front of the skirt, matching up the raw diagonal edges, and then sew straight along the traced seam allowance line on the diagonal edge. However, I stopped sewing when I got to the top seam allowance of the back skirt piece. I just need to leave some loose at the top that I can attach to the waistband piece in a minute. Before I do that though, I need to repeat for the other back piece. Then I'm going to make sure my bib piece is folded forwards, and then match up the raw edge of the waistband with the raw edge of the skirt back pieces, and sew along my seam allowance line, making sure to pick up where I left off when attaching the front of the skirt to the waistband. When I get to the end, I'm going to fold it up and then fold in the seam allowance on the end of my waistband piece and sew that down as well. For the straps, I've first taken my strap pattern piece and folded in the two longest sides so that the raw edges kind of meet in the center, and then I have glued them in place the same way I did with the pockets. Now, something else we're going to need is the fastener on the end of the straps. You can buy actual miniature versions of these on sites like Etsy. However, I think by now you all know that I prefer to try and work with what I have. So instead, I'm going to recycle a couple of these, which are the hook closures from the back of an old bra, which is a little bit embarrassing. However, I try to waste as little as I can, so we're going to reuse these as closures for our doll overalls. Before I do that though, I do need to use some needle nose pliers to basically unfurl these two loops, creating a relatively flat continuous line at the top. And then I'm going to get my strap piece and thread it through that hole, wrapping it around the straight top bar that we've just created. And then I'm going to use another little dot of fabric glue to secure the wrapped end to the back of the rest of the strap. Once the glue has dried, I'm using my yellow thread again to sew two nice neat lines up the sides of the straps. Once both the straps are made, I can go ahead and sew the end that doesn't have the little hook on the end onto the back bib of my overalls, angling them slightly outwards. Now the back piece is fully sewn together, I need to attach it to the rest of the dress. However, I do have a little bit of a dilemma, in that obviously I need these panels to close in the back, and so I can't attach the back bib piece all the way along the waistband, or else obviously I won't be able to open and shut the back of the skirt anymore. However, since it does overlap over halfway, I'm going to attach about 3/4 of the back to one of the back panels, which means the other quarter needs to be hemmed. So I'm going to just cut a little notch into the seam allowance of my back piece, about approximately 1/4 of the way along, and fold just that one tab up. I'm gluing mine into place once again, and then I can sew it once the glue has dried, just like all the other little bits. So now it's just this remaining raw edge that I need to sew onto whichever panel I want to cross over the top of the other. And then just like the front panel, I'm going to place it good side to good side with the waistband, line up the raw edges, and then sew them together along my seam allowance line, if you've got any of your tracings left at this point, that is. Now once that is flipped up, I can wrap it around, and as you can see, the side that is loose kind of sits just on top of the waistband. I spent a very long time trying to think of a better solution, but fingers crossed this will suffice. So now we need to match up these remaining raw edges below the closure tab, good side to good side. So down from the tab to the bottom hem along the seam allowance line, and flip the skirt right side out. And as you can see, I haven't hemmed the bottom, and that's because I want to kind of intentionally fray it. So I'm going to kind of pull any little white threads that are poking out. Not too much, just enough to create this like blue fluff at the bottom of the dress. Working my way all the way around the hem of the skirt, and trying to keep the amount of fraying even all the way around. Chop off these loose hanging white threads. And that is our hem all finished. Next, I need to attach something that I can fasten those hooks on the ends of our straps to. And my solution to that is a couple of these, which are actually like jewellery findings. They are the posts that you would glue a stud earring to. And I think that when I poke them into the bib, they'll work nicely to fasten our straps. However, I'm not the biggest fan of the metals being two different colours, so I have painted the flat part on the front silver before pushing it through the denim. And then on the other side, I'm just going to use my pliers to bend the post down. Hopefully that should prevent it from slipping back out. Now we can test to make sure that they fasten well. And they do. Now we just need to make sure that the back can fasten properly as well. And I actually just had a small epiphany about how to attach the loose edge of the back bib. I realised that I also had the other half of the fastener from those bra hooks we used earlier. And I'm going to sew one side to that loose bib flap, and the opposite side just below on the skirt piece. So now when I close the flap, I can fasten the hook and it'll keep the loose back bib piece in place. The final thing left to do is sew the Velcro into my tab. Now all that's left is to get her dressed. Thank you so much for watching. I very much hope that this video was useful. Please let me know down in the comments if you plan to make this dress for one of your dolls, as well as what kind of clothing tutorials you'd like to see me make in the future. See you next time. Bye!